serious matter. My name is Gabor Gombos, and it's a real privilege to be a co-director of this summer school on a topic which 15 years ago, I think very few of us could dream having a summer school. And after Daniel's keynote presentation, we are having something which I would call as a keynote panel. 15, 20 years ago, and my fear is that if you go to psychiatric conferences that until now, you find sessions called the user perspective. And this panel is called the user perspective. But the two user perspectives are not the same. In the traditional so-called discourses, it was an add-on to something which was the real issue. And here we are really trying to give another keynote to the entire week, which is ahead of us. User experts who are very privileged experts and who are in this panel are not experts only through their personal expertise. They have that type of expert knowledge which you cannot get in any college, any university course. But in addition to that, all of them have their own professional expertise as well, which should never be ignored as it has been ignored in the past and in too many discourses until now. It's amazing that we have so many participants in this room, and it's also challenging. So my anxiety level, which is a good news for the global mental health movement, I guess, is pretty high. In order to facilitate interaction, which Charles introduced in the very beginning of the day, I thought that we structure the panel as follows. I have 3 questions to each of the panelists who will answer briefly in a focused manner to those 3 questions. And then we will open up the session for a discussion. And all in all, we have 1 hour minus 5 minutes, what I have been speaking. So on the panel, we have Liz Brosnan, who wrote her PhD on user involvement, which I think we have heard about a lot in the past 2-3 decades, depending on which country you come from. And I think that when we will listen to her answer, we will get a little picture about whether it is involvement, and if yes, in what sense. Currently, Liz works in London in a user survivor-led research program. And Liz, you are very welcome. Our next panelist is Jolijn Santegoeds. I hope that my pronunciation was not overly wrong, who is, among other things, co-chair of the World Network of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry, and one of the European champions for alternatives to coercion-based psychiatry. And as each of us here at this panel, she also has her personal experience besides working on policy from local to global levels, as well as managing a real grassroots alternatives to coercion. And Michael Njenga from Kenya is the executive director of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry Kenya, who has been involved in research on legal capacity and its relevance in the African context, as well as on issues regarding right to live in the community and independently. So you can see that we have a really prestigious and distinguished panel. So the 3 questions I will ask each of you are these. first question is, what, in your opinion, are the three most timely, most urging human rights concerns experienced by persons with psychosocial disabilities in your country and globally? And then the second question is that what are the three areas where you can see some progress since the entry into force of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities? And finally, the last question is, what in your expertise are the blocks where no progression happened since the CRPD is in force, or where you could say that there is some retrogression? So these are the three questions, and Liz, the floor is yours.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here speaking to you. My impression, in terms of a timely, something that is really urgent time-wise to move on the CRPD, I'm talking locally in Ireland. We have not yet ratified the CRPD in this country. The government gives their rationale for that is that they say they want all their legislation to be CRPD compliant, especially around assisted decision-making and mental health legislation. So they give this is their rationale for not ratifying the CRPD. And that's a huge, that to me, as an issue, does not hold any water, because the bar is so, the changes that are so important in order to make anything CRPD compliant, that sort of ignores the whole concept of progressive realization, because nothing can ever be as, legislation needs to be constantly evolving, and you cannot wait until everything is so-called compliant in order to. So that's my first urgent, timely issue in Ireland. More importantly, and as we heard from the panel this morning, the question about the power imbalance and the as distinct from chemical imbalance. I mean, we within the survivor service user community have been so aware of this for so long, because in every way our knowledge, our experience, everything that we have been arguing for so long is up against the greater power and credibility that science, the claim psychiatry has to its science, it's very hard to argue against the power and the prestige of psychiatry. But I think that education for the community, education for people with psychosocial disabilities, for people with disabilities generally, about the potential of the CRPD is really, really significant. Also, professionals, people working in services need to understand the implications of the CRPD. And as well as that, I think, in terms of timely concerns, some of the vast amounts of money that are going into institutional psychiatry really needs to be spent on people who have good ideas about how alternatives can be provided to people to help prevent the need for hospital admissions. There are many initiatives that have been developed globally by people within the who have experienced psychiatry, often forcefully. They've developed alternatives like places where people can find other supports. I'm thinking of things like intentional peer support, which meets people, it's trauma-informed and it meets people where they're at and works with them on the journey to find resolution to the issues. There are many examples that we'll talk about in other days. Also, I suppose, and something that we'll be talking about tomorrow, is the whole development of MAD studies, a whole new development of knowledge from the perspective of people who have been psychiatrized, people who have knowledge and critiques and ideas to present to as a counter discourse to psychiatry's claims that people are irrational and therefore need the intervention of the mental health legislation. So in terms of timely concerns, looking at positive changes, things that have happened since the CRPD has been developed. Well, the first and most important thing, I think, for people in from our community is that human rights have moved beyond being a moral persuasion argument. We've actually begun to win some cases at the European Court of Human Rights, and I think those wins, like in the last few years, have been really significant. I'm having a blank about the names, but I'm sure Gabor can fill people in on the specific cases, like Rusty Stanev's and other cases. So that we've moved beyond moral persuasion. And I also feel for us within the user community, really, really significant things have been the work of the UN CRPD committee and the two rapporteurs. The reports and comments, the general comments that have been coming out from the committee have been really, really significant and encouraging for us within the community and our activism to try and move on articulating that a different way is possible, that we really do need to have more, that our rights, the right to legal capacity needs to be recognised, and we need to find more support, more funding, more work to explain, to study, to show how supported decision-making can make a huge difference in people's lives. I suppose locally in Ireland, the CRPD has become, or the centre here, the Centre for Disability Law and Policy, has become recognised as a leader, a source of expertise in terms of the students, the masters that are happening, but also the way that the centre works and coordinates a civil society campaign for legal capacity. There is beginning to be some recognition and some debate about legal capacity and the need for supported decision-making, and that was particularly evident when we had our campaign to around the Assisted Decision-Making Act, which was passed in 2015. There was a strong legal civil society involvement in that campaign. We had some major concerns about the issues, but there was some involvement of civil society with the legislators, albeit quite disappointing in what we were finally able to achieve, because in the end, we feel that psychiatry's power overrode the arguments that we were making. And I suppose another thing that I think is timely, and I hope Mary will talk about another time, is a major research report that was carried out here in Ireland onto the implementation of the Mental Health Act. And I find Chapter 4 of that study actually asked people what their experiences was of being detained involuntarily. And the report, the findings of how people describe their experiences is really really important, and I don't think it can be glossed over that, well, this was done in their best interests. It really does need to be read by many people, because the people describe the trauma of being involuntarily coerced in that chapter. Some of the rest of the report is very, very from a clinical psychiatry perspective, so read those at your peril. And finally, I suppose obstacles. Well, I have been touching on obstacles as I try, and the positives, because the obstacles are immense. I mentioned the Irish government's position. Some of the other bodies that are supposed to be mechanisms for supporting civil society are not necessarily the most powerful force for change because they're quite conservative, either led by policymakers or psychiatrists and people who really do need to have a change of mind, a change of emphasis that can only happen when people engage with the perspective of people who have lived through the experiences that we're talking about: coercion, denial of legal capacity, forceful treatment against their will, and so on. Another obstacle, I suppose, in terms of, I mentioned our mental health, our Assisted Decision-Making Act, well, we ended up with disappointingly a functional test of capacity, so that people must prove their, it's not a universal recognition of capacity, it's a functional test. And really also disappointingly, advanced healthcare directives, which might be some comfort and resource people, and they might be able to use them as a tool if they're involuntarily detained in an ideal world. Under our Mental Assisted Decision-Making Act, these can be overruled once somebody is detained under the Mental Health Act. And I'll finally say that there's really lack of public debate, awareness in general among the public, among a lot of people in our own community about legal capacity and the CRPD, so there needs to be a lot more education and talk and debate.
Thank you, Liz, very much. We have to be very strict on time because we have so many participants and we really want to have some interaction. So, Jolijn, the questions are the same. First, what are the three major, most timely, urgent issues, human rights issues experienced by people with psychosocial disabilities? The second is what progress you can see since the entry into force of the CRPD. And the third question is where you see no progression, or maybe you can even see retrogression, and what can, in your opinion, be done to move forward?
Okay, thank you. Well, my concerns, I'm from the Netherlands, and I see that despite that the CRPD is already 10 years old, forced treatments are still ongoing. They have not stopped. And I think this is a very big concern for me. In many other disability sectors, we see progress being made. And I have the feeling that actually very little things have actually happened since the CRPD came. And I think that's very worrying. Coming from the Netherlands, I had high expectations from the Netherlands because there is this a number of other human rights that have been embraced by the Netherlands. So I am really shocked to find out that the CRPD on this point, especially regarding forced treatments, has not led to a significant change or a debate, which leads me to the second point. My second big concern is in the Netherlands and in many other countries as well, there's still a wrong explanation of what human rights mean in mental health care. So they will say the right to care, the right to health, it will imply that you need to be protected or you need to be treated when you have this mental health condition, and then you can be locked up. But there is no right to solitary confinement or whatsoever in any human rights treaty, but still it is explained like this. And even despite that the CRPD is now 10 years old, there is a lack of understanding that forced treatments are human rights violations. And this new understanding and the new explanation of human rights, it really needs to come across. And yeah, we have to build this new narrative of what is human rights, what is real, true care, because real care, it is possible and it has nothing to do with force. And that is, I am really worried that after 10 years, there is still so little progress. And in the Netherlands, and also in many other countries, there's a kind of split up in the user movement. And that is also very concerning, I think. There are a number of groups in the Netherlands who have come to agree to the so-called necessary forced treatments. Basically, in my opinion, it is, if you don't agree, you're not allowed to leave the hospital. So they are basically, in my opinion, to some extent brainwashed to say that, okay, this is needed and I have to accept it and I'm ill, yeah, this is, you know, they are really demotivated, or I don't know how to say it. And the people in power, the psychiatrists and the politicians, they like to refer to this group as the user. And then they ignore our voice as being more radical, and then we have no insight in our illness or whatever. All these arguments, they still prevail. And I think this is one of my big concerns, because in this way, this is an obstacle for change. And I think that also makes us different from the broader disability movement. And the fact that the psychosocial disability has so many specificalities makes us a little bit of an outsider within the disability movement. And now we risk again to be marginalized. And yeah, that is really concerning. I would wish that we could be part of this mainstream change, but after 10 years, I have this big fear that we are missing out. So these are my true concerns. And then, but of course, there's also positive things, luckily. So when the CRPD came, well, at first I didn't understand what it said, because it's all this legal language, and they are supposed to be my rights, but I cannot even read what it means. So that's an obstacle. But when I finally understood what it meant, I felt this intense recognition, and I was, yes, finally somebody who is in a position of power says this out loud. It was so incredibly valuable for me, and this gave me so much empowerment. I was already, before the CRPD, I was advocating for full abolition of forced treatments, but when I learned about the CRPD, I really felt like, yeah, I'm on the right track. Nobody is going to stop me now. So this really helps. And I didn't feel so alone anymore, because before we were just fighting as one of the user movements, but now I can see that there's more support from other sectors that are embracing the CRPD. So I really find that very supportive, and I think this is a gain. So this is a positive outcome. And also there is increased discussion, because earlier there was often saying, yeah, but you have to accept the reality, forced treatments are reality, and of course you can disagree with it, and maybe we can humanize the forced treatments a little bit, so thank you for your input, but that was all within the margin. And now, in several platforms, by far not in all places, but at several platforms, you really see a core discussion about forced treatments. And I think this is also a very important step forwards. It's taking long, but at least this step is made. So these are positives for me. And then, where the third question was, where it's not working, right? So then again, I don't see a change in the practices. And so we see changing words on paper, and in this high-level EU things, they make nice paperwork, but what is really happening? If I go to a psychiatric institution in the Netherlands, I don't think very much has changed since the CRPD came. and it's a fact the Netherlands only ratified last year with, I think, maybe the most interpretive declarations of all of Europe. But yeah, I don't care about the paperwork. I really want to see the real change, and that is, I don't see it. And I think what we can do is create alternatives so that at least on the grassroots, on the ground level, we can indeed see the change. And even if the laws are not changed, we can still change the practice, because you don't need, if there are alternative practices, the law can still be in place, but then you just don't use the law. So I don't like to only focus on the law reforms. Yeah, the law reforms are another obstacle, a big barrier, a place where I don't see progress. In fact, in the Netherlands, I can only see things going in the wrong direction. They are opening up for more forced treatment options because they still think this is the best way to treat people. And we see at the Council of Europe, they are now making this draft additional protocol to the Oviedo Convention, which is a very, very concerning thing. This draft additional protocol is a European additional tool to several human rights conventions that are existing, and it's about the procedure for involuntary placement and involuntary treatment of persons with mental disorder unable to consent. That is still the language they use. They call themselves a Council of Europe with human rights, but they completely miss out on the CRPD. This draft additional protocol is even worse than the MI principles from the 1990s. So it's 30 years later, and nothing has changed. The language is still the same. And in Europe, the Council of Europe standards, they are used in the European Court. If these standards are coming through, these will be newer standards, so it will, in some extent, overrule the CRPD. This is really a dangerous trend. And yeah, this is very worrying to me. So we really have to make sure that the direction of the developments is changed and not going on the same pace as, or in the same foot that it has been up to now. And another place where I don't see change is the access to justice. Not on the national level, also not on the international level. As I said, the European Court is still having this very much outdated standards. The few cases that have been won have been, they had to work very creative to get through the system, but it's an old system. It leaves no room. So these are my, yeah, the things that I don't see change. I have no solution for how to access justice. So.
Thank you very much, Jolijn. Both of you mentioned the lack of or insufficient debates and discussions around coercion, around legal capacity, and the related issues. And just to give a brief testimony on what Jolijn said, that the practice has not been really changing. When I experienced the involuntary treatment 3 years ago, I could get out of that within 3 days, not because of the CRPD, not because of any law, not even policy. It was because I had friends who were my advocates, who believed in the CRPD, and they were empowered by the CRPD, but the system did not know about the CRPD, they did not care about the CRPD, and yet indirectly, through my friend advocates, we managed to get me out of the system within a very short period of time. But I experienced that really within psychiatry. In Hungary, there was no change between 20 years ago and 3 years ago. So Michael, the very same questions to you, and neither Liz nor Jolijn gave any revolutionary idea how to go further in the good direction. So everybody expects you, Michael, to give us some courageous suggestions on that also.
Thank you very much, Gabor, and I think it's a pleasure to actually speak at the summer school. It's always difficult to speak after two eloquent speakers. I'm actually wondering what to say. But I think for me, the first principal area of concern is that despite the fact that we have the CRPD, most countries continue to legislate on oppressive laws and practices which actually are not CRPD compliant, laws which promote forced treatment, laws which allow for the deprivation of liberty, especially for persons with psychosocial disability. And I think in the African context, one of the most significant things is we have to appreciate that also there's a whole issue of practice. That the problem we have, for example, with the whole issue of legal capacity and decision making, it's not fundamentally in the law. It's about the fact that families and communities make decisions on behalf of persons with psychosocial disability, which is a huge problem. So for me, it's about oppressive laws and practices. And I don't think our biggest problem is institution. Actually, our biggest problem is civil detention, where people are deprived of their liberty within their families and within their community. So it's a whole discussion around oppressive laws and, again, oppressive practices as one of the most principal areas of concern. Now, we're having great conversations about the Sustainable Development Goals, and one of the most principal area of concern for me is about the inclusion of persons with psychosocial disability in development processes. Government in Africa will tend to be more responsive to development issues other than issues which are perceived to be human rights. So for me, the fact that persons with psychosocial disabilities are not included in development processes is a huge issue of concern when we take into consideration that most of them actually live in abject poverty and they have limited employment opportunities. So the whole discussion around SDGs and how we make sure that persons with psychosocial disabilities are included is very, very critical. The third thing is the whole discussion about the medical model versus the social model. And I think I've grown up in a system where the only thing I understood which could fix my problems was going to a psychiatrist and not looking at other underlying issue and the kind of support system that I might require to live independently and being included in the community. So the whole tensions and the whole transition between the medical model and the social and human right approach is very, very significant. And I think lastly, sorry, Gabor, you said three, but I have to say this one, the fourth one. It's how we build, the fact that we need to build strong movements, both at the grassroots level and at the continental level and at the global level. In order for us to be able to effect social change, I think we must be able to know how to play, the politics of social change. So where do I think we have areas where we've made positive changes? And I want to reflect back in Kenya about public policy and connect this with the concluding observations of the CRPD committee. For example, in my country, we have a technical committee which is working with government towards the implementation of the CRPD in the country. And I think that for me is hugely positive in terms of law reform. Because we've been able to work, for example, on the Persons with Disabilities Bill, trying to make it compliant with the CRPD. The Legal Aid Bill, also trying to make it compliant with the CRPD. And this is impetus, actually, which have been built from the concluding observations of the CRPD committee. And just to point out at the regional level about the African Disability Protocol, which significantly have borrowed a lot from the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, while at the same time trying to make it contextual to the realities that face persons with disabilities in Africa. And recently, there was a High Court ruling in Kenya on Article 12 of the CRPD, which means that gradually we're able to create case law towards the implementation of the CRPD in the country. So I think that for me has been very, very important. So in terms of best practices we've been able to do a couple of things, which maybe we are going to be speaking later in the week, to establish the link between peer support and Article 12 of the Convention. So I think, yeah, that is also something which is very, very important. And also reforms around access to justice, and especially with a specific focus on how do we provide support and accommodation to ensure that persons with psychosocial and intellectual disabilities are able to participate in the justice system on an equal basis with others. Thirdly, I think the CRPD have created an impetus towards greater inclusion of persons with psychosocial disability within the disability movement. I think it have opened up those particular spaces, which is very, very important. So what do I think are the most pressing challenges? I think my first fundamental problem is in relation to mental health laws and whether they are really compliant or they can be compliant with the CRPD. And also the discussion around whether we need mental health laws or whether we don't need them. I mean, those are the complex things, because we've tried drafting a mental health law in Kenya, which I can assure you is nowhere near being CRPD compliant. So the question is, do we want to legislate on mental health laws, and if we do, are they going to be compliant with the CRPD? Or do we want to address mental health issues in the general health law? So that's something. Then the second question is about representation. For me, social change is about representation. So when you don't have persons with psychosocial disability, for example, represented across all spheres in life, whether it is at the local level, whether it's at the national level and international level, then it means that we are not going to be on the table when decisions are being made, in various levels. And I think for me, the whole issue of how we are represented across the board is very, very important. I think my last point is about coalition building. How do we include persons with disabilities in the cross-disability movement? How do we make sure that their voices are heard in the cross-disability movement? How do we get into the mainstream movements in our country? For example, if it is the women movement, do we have women with disabilities being represented in those particular forums? I think that is very, very important. That I think moving forward, it is very, very important for us to reflect on how we build those kind of coalitions, whether within mainstream organizations or whether we want to do that, of course, how we do that around the mainstream disability movement. And I think it's the whole discussions of alternatives. So for example, in Kenya, we have traditional healers who plays a very important role in terms of mental health service delivery. But the big question is there's a lot of resistance, especially from the medical professional, to integrate and to try and work around with traditional healers within that particular country. So I think also that's a big issue. How do we develop alternatives, and how do we take advantage of existing alternatives to the mental health medical model within our countries? Yeah, I think those are my key point in terms of going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Both Jolijn and you mentioned the relevance of the relationship between the movement of people with psychosocial disabilities and people with other disabilities. and Jolijn spoke about becoming marginalized again within the cross-disability movements. And Michael, you mentioned that CRPD actually opened up cooperation between us and other groups of persons with disabilities. These may be two sides of the same coin, I think. So thank you all the panelists so far. And now the floor is yours, dear participants. And this is the unique opportunity